Coming up, we'll talk to a man who went looking for his parents' India and found a new country.
This program was made possible by funding from the UCF Global Perspectives Office.
Hello and welcome to the Global Perspectives Show. I'm John Bersia, Special Assistant to the President for Global Perspectives at the University of Central Florida. Our guest today is Anand Giridharadas, who is a columnist for the New York Times. Welcome.
It's great to be here.
Good to have you here. Tell us a little bit about how you became involved with the Times. I know you spent several years in India reporting and writing columns. Tell us about that experience.
It was terrific. I began reporting for both papers in 2005 in Bombay, after moving there about a year and a half before that.
And this is the New York Times and the International Herald Tribune, which we... Exactly.
And began in March of 2005 and stayed in that role for about exactly 4.5 years. And had a wonderful time. It was in many ways kind of pre-global financial crisis, and it was really the boom years in India. And boom years not only in the kind of financial terms and the stock market soaring and all of that, which happened, but also kind of culturally, socially, psychologically, India was engaged and continues to be engaged in an extraordinary metamorphosis. And it was really a privilege to be part of that and to witness it.
Now, what is the single most impressive aspect of that experience for you? What was something that surprised you or amazed you, something you didn't expect as part of the experience?
You know, I think I come at this from a slightly different perspective as someone whose parents are Indian, but I grew up entirely in this country and in Europe, and had only visited India a little bit in childhood, a few weeks every few years. And so I had a sense of what India was, but it was a fleeting and kind of distorted sense. But that sense was always a very stagnant, frozen, dead country. And it was kind of the socialism of that era, it was scarcity, and it was also cultural. It was a country in which tradition ruled and people did things because they had been done before, and that was that. At least that was my impression of it. And so what struck me most coming back was the complete breakage of that freeze and the very rapid thaw. Now, of course, it's not all 1 billion people at once, but very quickly there was this new idea, if I have to distill it, that destiny is something you make. In a society in which, quite famously, if people know anything about India, they know, that the society very, very superstitious and religious beliefs and a strong belief in destiny, karma, whatever you call it. There was a new rising generation of young people who were quite clear that destiny was up to them, who argue through their lives that you have to happen to history, you don't let history happen to you. And once people start to think that, you have a kind of internal combustion in a society that's hard to reverse, even if it takes time to fully diffuse.
Now, you selected topics entirely on your own, or was there some guidance from editors?
There were some specific stories that I was asked to do, and usually those are the smaller news events. People would say, the stock market's about to break 10,000, you should do something. Or they've made an announcement about this, you should do that. Most of what I did was feature stories. And those are self-directed, generally, for the reason that editors in other countries have very little way to know really what's new, what's fresh. If they knew about it, it would be because it was in the press, and then it's too late to write it. And that's, that's the treat of the job. You kind of go around and you, if you've read about it, it's too late. So you talk to people and you go to villages and you go to small towns. I travel a lot, and all of the kind of breakthrough insights for me that really arrested me, none of them came through reading anything. They all came through being out there, and people saying, you know, a sentence to you in a little restaurant in a small town, and you just think, oh my God, that's something.
What was your favorite story or your favorite issue?
I think the ambitions of young people was really staggering to me, because they were so quickly undoing the India that had been in my mind since childhood, in which people kind of told the same jokes and repeated the same cliches and had the same beliefs about Pakistan and America and whatever else. And these young people had no colonial hangover insecurity, none. They were oblivious to the fact that India had been colonized in their being. They were very proud to be Indian. They were at the same time very open to global influences, in large part because they're not as insecure, so they can embrace it without it threatening them. They work really, really hard. They have fire. They, I think, are in many ways the most important next generation in the world. It's not just you have to understand how to trade with India or how India is going to behave diplomatically. You have to understand that next generation, because it is their views on climate change that will determine whether the world goes off the brink or doesn't. It is their view, you know, what do they think about Pakistan? Because you could argue that a lot of the problems with terrorism in Afghanistan, Pakistan, have to do with Pakistan being so insecure about India, because Pakistan doesn't know, is India going to be relent on Kashmir, not relent on Kashmir, etc. Again, the views of that young generation are crucial. So I spent a lot of time just trying to understand who they are, what they want from the world, and it was really rewarding.
The environment and climate change are two of the hot topics here at the University of Central Florida. And I'm wondering, since you grew up in the United States and then had this multi-year experience in India and spent a lot of time with the young people, how do their views compare with the views of young people here on the climate change issue specifically?
It's, of course, difficult to generalize. I would say a few broad things. One, I think there's some of these things are just global movements, right? So people in India saw an inconvenient truth the way people here saw it. And so there's some things that just kind of move now in tandem in a global world, and a little bit more here and there. But even an issue like gay rights, it's hard to have serious movement in one country on that without it sort of affecting the conversation in every country. So that a bit of that is happening. But I think the biggest difference is, for reasons that are understandable, the young rising generation in India, the people who have done the best from this new economy, are very, very focused on personal success. Now I say it's understandable because there were many fewer opportunities for personal success, fewer opportunities to get rich, and perhaps even more than that, fewer opportunities in a kind of the Indian family context to stand out as an individual. To have your own house, no matter how much money you had, to be different from other people. And people are now delighting in all the new opportunities to make money, to stand out, to do something different, to rise. And that's great. But that sometimes can come at the expense of social concern. That was my biggest concern in many ways, that I didn't hear. You didn't hear people who are committed to kind of ideas that matter to them more than their next promotion. Again, understandable, but it's more than 1 billion people. And I think there is a debate in some quarters in India about how do you have not just energy, but also a compass.
What do you think comes at the end of the day with this rise? Some people look at rising powers and are concerned that they might harbor military ambitions. I don't think that's the case with India. But what do you think the Indian people want, 25, 50 years from now? Do you think there's a goal out there that they're hoping to reach?
I mean, I think, first of all, it's silly for any country to fear or kind of criticize the rise of any other country, particularly from the standpoint of a country that is, quite fully risen. Second, I think a lot of the fear is misplaced. It is true that these countries, they have more money, they have bigger militaries. India has actually quite a bit of power projection in the Indian Ocean. I think the question is, would you rather have a world that has a lot of, India has more poor people today than sub-Saharan Africa. That's not a good world for anybody. It causes problems that we don't even understand it's causing us everywhere. So in a way, I think the effects in the military and all that's what the media talks about a lot are much less profound and actually matter a lot less and affect the world Americans live in a lot less than kind of the prospect that we're going to pull, 1 billion plus people in a few different countries out of what has been a pretty bad, desperate situation. And I think generally speaking, according to most economists, that's pretty good for everybody, even though it causes perhaps severe dislocations over the short term.
And there is the potential for many of those people to rise along with India over time.
I mean, people have said this famously, but and I think there's a bit of hyperbole in it. But it's true that there will be 500 million more people who can afford blue jeans in India and cars than in a certain number of years than there are right now. Now, it's not a given that America or any other country will be able to make those jeans or cars, but if it's good, it can. That's a better world for a lot of people. I mean, look at what the U.S. is hoping for in China, to get the Chinese consumer to consume. The Indian consumer has fewer problems consuming, and that is something that really could be a very positive thing for this country.
Well, with that, we'll take a short break, and we'll be right back. Hello, we're talking about India with a man who knows it well. Welcome back. Tell us a little bit about your book project. You've got a book called India Calling that's coming out soon. What's the essence of that?
Well, it's two stories interwoven. It's the story of my parents leaving India in the 1970s. My father in search of opportunity and my mother to follow my father to the U.S. after they married. And the story of my returning a generation later and finding a totally different country. And the second story that's then woven in with that is the story of how India itself has changed in that intervening time. And essentially what happened to the one country they left to turn it into the other country I returned to.
What stories have your parents told you that have really influenced your life and your work?
In a way, I mean, the book begins with the fact, which is probably common to any number of immigrants, that a lot of our stories, and I didn't in a way realize this until the book was written, a lot of my tacit knowledge as a child was sitting around and talking about, directly or indirectly, India. Because it was where their lives were, my parents' lives were, and their formative stories were, where their love story had taken root, where their ideas and values and way of seeing the world had come from. And so, over the course of a life, I'd received this kind of second-hand or third-hand kind of education in India, but never straightforward of, this is Indian history, this is Indian politics. Just kind of transpired in through these little anecdotes and family stories, and yet it had kind of congealed into a big sense of what India was in my mind. Now, that sense may have had nothing to do with the reality, but you end up developing an idea of a country that you think you know. And so it was a rude shock in 2003 to arrive in India and realize that the reality was very different. And partly different because certain things had changed drastically since they left, and that's what I talk about in the book. But also because some of those things had never been right to begin with. And the project in many ways was to set out on a journey to kind of figure out and measure the India in my mind against the India that was awaiting me when I landed in August 2003.
So did the stories your parents shared with you help inspire your choice of a career to become a writer? Or was
I don't know. I mean, I think, you know, probably indirectly, and I don't know if I could draw that line directly, but certainly storytelling, and my mother in particular is a very gifted storyteller, and I think there was definitely I think part of coming from somewhere else is that you need your story to be told a little more than if your story is self-evident. If you grew up near the same church in the same neighborhood and your friends are the same people that they were over a few generations, there's less that needs to be explained. When your context is not around you, it's actually somewhere else, as my parents' context was not around them. The things that explain them, the justifications of their choices, the sources of their ideas. You need storytelling to kind of form the bridge between where you stand now and what formed you.
You were talking about certain issues that were not as you had thought they were based on stories you had heard. What would be an example of something that was a surprise in that way?
A very simple one is, but very important, is in my mind, there was a simple line between the old India was really non-Westernized, and so the new India must be Westernizing. And that was just a simple duality I created in my mind. And if you go to India today, there's a lot of evidence to support that. There's malls coming up, and there's people are, you know, buying espressos where they used to buy masala chai and things like that. But that is a way of seeing the process that's unfolding in India, very much through the lens of someone who saw India as very traditional before and now becoming Westernized. Actually, something much more complicated is happening. There is a craze to become Western in certain ways, people learning English, the malls, the jeans. At the same time, as I hinted at earlier, there is an overthrowing of that old colonial hangover. And so the way I put it in the book is more and more people in India strive to learn English today, but fewer and fewer Indians strive to be English. In my parents' generation, what a lot of people were after when they went to good schools was to be as close as possible to an Englishman. That is just not a dream that young Indians have. Young Indians of all walks of life could not seem to imagine something more exciting than to be Indian. And that is a profound change that I couldn't see until I shed some of those earlier ways of seeing.
A lot of Indian students have come to the United States for college, university. Is that something that is as appealing now as it would have been 10 or 20 years ago, or is there so much exciting going on in India now that there's really no desire to go elsewhere?
When you have more than 1 billion people in a country, what you're going to see is that both are true. So it's not like you're going to see a let up in the number of people coming here, because if some people stop coming here, if 20 million people who are going to come stop coming, there will still be 20 million more people to say, okay, I'll go. So statistically, you're not going to see a drop in the number of Indians studying elsewhere. But you are absolutely right that there is a number of Indians who would have had the choice to leave, who now choose to stay. And an easy place to see that is the IIT engineering schools and IIM business schools. And a huge proportion of their graduates in the time that I was there quite suddenly flipped from emigrating to staying.
What are some of the emerging areas that you think will be of greater importance? You mentioned technology. Are there other areas that you think will open up where Indians will find opportunities at home in places where they didn't exist before?
I think the most exciting thing is cell phones in terms of a discrete technology. This is something that's hard to explain to people in America because the cell phone, for whatever reason, is just not as central here. I think it's partly because many people have a screen to be in front of all day, and the screen is vastly superior to the cell phone. It's because America was an early adopter of cell phone technology, so in a way it has the worst infrastructure because it was the first. There's a number of reasons. But in India, the cell phone is, the simple way to explain it that I use is it's people's all-in-one device. It's a computer, a flashlight, a radio, an alarm clock, an oven probably, and God knows what people use it for. Because it's, for many people, the only device they have.
It's even an office.
It's everything. And it's also a bedroom. Now what I mean by it being a bedroom is India is changing in some ways and not changing as quickly in others. One of the ways in which it's not changing is that young people still actually have quite limited space to pursue romance outside the auspices of their family, to kind of, pursue freelance romance that's not with marriage in mind and parent sponsored. Now, as a result, and something that shapes this and is shaped by it is the fact that a lot of young people don't have their own bedrooms. That's also economics, but it's also the fact that when you have your own bedroom, certain freedoms can flower. And the cell phone becomes a bedroom for people like that, who may be 26 years old, still living with their parents, working in a job somewhere. And it's the first thing they own that no one can look into. Their parents probably don't even know how to use as well as they do. They can, and you see all day long, you see maids and drivers and cooks in Indian cities, taking a break and standing and texting with a big smile on their face. And it's an extraordinary explosion of freedom. And I think there's now a lot of people thinking about, how do you deliver healthcare on phones? How do you do education on phones? Can phones substitute for teachers in a country with a very high level of absenteeism? How can you have phones replace bank accounts for people who don't even have bank accounts? So one area that's very exciting and under-discussed is, I think India will be India and cell phones is kind of like America and cars in the 50s.
Is this part of the India calling concept?
Not at all, actually.
Okay, I was just wondering as I was listening.
No, it's not actually. But I mean, it's in the book, but that's not the reason. That's not the reason it's called that. It's called that because it called out to me to come back, and far more importantly, because what changed, I think, was that it began as a country to call on its own people to become the fullest possible expressions of themselves.
Now you have a book coming out, but a lot of writers are already thinking about the next one. Do you have an idea for that next book? Or
I have an idea, but I will leave that for our next conversation. It needs to gestate before it prematurely goes away.
Tell us a little bit about your column. You write that, is it twice monthly?
Twice monthly. It's called Currents, and it's a column on ideas, culture. I've done a lot on technology. It's quite open-ended. The perspective is a little clearer. I mean, I think I try to write it as, although I'm no longer in India and now thinking about totally different issues, I try to write it a little bit as someone who came back from what I came back from, who's seen in a way, not the future, but who's seen kind of certain forces that are blowing this way. And in India, you see a lot of the forces of globalization in a way more acutely than you see them here. So I write about globalization a lot, but even when I'm not, I try to write from the vantage point of someone who is between these different worlds. I think a lot of the people who write columns are much more clearly from one place, and that has its advantages. And I, come from a slightly different orientation.
Good. Well, Mr. Giridharadas, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And thank you. And for the Global Perspective Show, I'm John Bersia. We'll see you next time.
This program was made possible by funding from the UCF Global Perspectives Office.